pleased to say our guest this time is Tim Trumper. He stepped down earlier this year as the chair of the NRMA after nearly 11 years on the board. Tim's also an advisor and an founding shareholder. Okay, our guest this time is Tim Trumper. He stepped down earlier this year as the chair of the NRMA after nearly 11 years on that board. Tim's also an advisor to and a founding shareholder of Quantium, the AI and data analytics company. On top of that, Tim's enjoyed a lengthy career in the media, and he's the author of a recent book called AI Game On. Tim, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure to be here, Bennett.
Tim, let's start by talking about that book. It's called AI Game On. Why did you write it, and how do its principles apply to today's boardrooms?
Well, I had, it was really two things made me write the book. The first was actually a conversation with John Mullen, who's a very distinguished Australian director, as you know, chair. And John actually probably doesn't know this, so if you're listening, John, stand by. But I had a conversation with him when I first became chair of the NRMA. So John was my chair a long time ago in another business. And I reached out to him and got some advice. And in that advice, he just said, look, Tim, you've got this very unusual thing going on with you're a founding shareholder and advisor with Quantium, so you're at the front row of the technology change and what's going with analytics and increasingly AI. You are chairing one of Australia's most trusted conglomerates, a 100-year-old mutual. Those two things are unusual combinations. Have you ever thought about writing some of that down for others to think about? That was the first spark. And then equally as important, I was in the internet. When the internet first hit, I was right there. Like in 1993, I was trying to bring Wired magazine to Australia. And I've been obsessed with technology and how it impacts business my whole career. And I could see how the internet effectively extracted lots of value out of Australia and put a lot of that value overseas. And a lot of Australian companies did not play the internet well. Some did, but some didn't. Many didn't. And with AI, I was really conscious that is going to happen again, and it's already happening. So I thought, well, make a contribution. And so the book was really written from a chair's and director's perspective about what to do with this situation. The subtitle of the book, the second part of your question, the subtitle of the book is How to Decide Who or What Decides. And when I walk into boardrooms and talk about AI, that is the conversation. How do we delegate to a machine? On what basis do we do that? What happens if we do it too much? What happens if we don't do it enough? And how do we get that balance of delegation to a new entity right?
AI, we know, is in the headlines pretty much every day. There are enormous opportunities out there for Australian organizations, Australian businesses. How should boards ensure that their companies are in the right position to grab those AI opportunities?
Well, maybe I'll start by what you're not going to hear in a boardroom in the next 5 years. I don't think you're going to hear these words. We had to let the CEO go because they were too good at using AI. Those words, you won't hear them. What you are going to hear is we had to let the CEO go because they couldn't get on the AI bus. To give you some sense of the speed of change here, here's a data point which actually just blew my mind. In the same amount of time that Moore's Law did 32x, so Moore's Law, chips double in capability and halve in price every 2 years. In the same amount of time that chips took to go 32x, some of the AI models did 1,000,000x. So the trajectory of change here is unimaginable, quite frankly. So what does that mean? That means that boards and management need to assess what does a 10x capability look like, because it's there if you know how to find it. So open the aperture, learn, get curious, and use the tools to discover what's available. So that's kind of, I think, table stakes. needs guardrails, needs rules, needs governance, manage risk. But the greatest risk we are seeing is the risk of inaction or slow action.
We'll get to that point around guardrails in a moment. But when boards and directors are talking to their management, talking to CEOs about AI, what sort of questions should they be asking to make sure their organizations are in position to grab those opportunities?
Sure. I mean, the number one question is, are we using it? And are you as an individual using it? Because it's hard to talk about what's available if you're not using the tools. That makes sense? It's hard to be expansive in your thinking if you've never seen what it can do. And that goes, Harvard Business Review, I quoted it in the book, had they called it HIPPOs, highest paid person opinion. Highest paid person opinion matters. So if the highest paid person, i.e. the CEO, if the CEO is not cognizant of what's happening here, it'll be really hard for a board to drive the change it needs. Conversely, if the CEO is, and we were talking about Adam Drusi, founder of Quantium before, so Adam is running that business through the lens of AI first. So the adoption, there's nowhere to hide because Adam's all over it and is pushing that to the team. So I think it's an example of how, if the CEO's there and the board are with the CEO supporting them, you'll see the adoption. The younger executives, people who are just graduating, they graduated using these tools pretty much, and they're looking for leadership actually about how to deploy it, how to scale it, and how to make sure their company is future facing to meet its customers' needs.
We're all excited about the opportunities and the positive sides to AI, but there is also another side. There are risks, there are potential dangers. How do you think boards can ensure they've got the right safeguards in place at their organizations, but without stifling innovation, without stifling growth?
Yeah, no, it's a completely valid and fair question. So, I mean, I mentioned in the book, it's a line actually from Greg Schneider at Quantium, who said, create a data AI Hippocratic oath. And so the Hippocratic oath is thousands of years old, and it says two things: do no harm to the patient in the medical sense, and keep the patient's information sacrosanct. As a North Star for your AI strategy, if you can think about first, second, and third order consequences of what you're building and be sure it's not causing harm to your customers or society, and then you keep the information sacrosanct, the chances of being on the wrong side of this have just come down a lot. Now, that doesn't mean that's your policy. You're going to have policies. You're going to have, ISO compliance if you can get it. They're all good things to have. What is the data used for? What is the use case? Can you put your hand in your heart and say the customer's winning here? I mean, if there's a story which I just can't get over this story. It's a true story about my wife. So she went into the Apple store and bought an iPad. And the iPad, she bought the iPad, brought it home, it wasn't working. And then she said, what should I do? And I said, well, ring Apple. She said, I can't ring Apple. She said, you can ring Apple. And you can ring Apple, and I've done it regularly. So you ring Apple. Now, this is the biggest company in the world by market value, plus or minus a bit. The phone answer said, we'll answer your call in 2 minutes 38. Do you want to listen to classical, jazz, blues, or silence? Silence. 2 minutes 38. Hi, this is Marianne. That's Elizabeth, isn't it? You bought an iPad this afternoon at the George Street store, the Apple store in Sydney this afternoon. Is this call relating to that? Yes. Solve. 30 seconds later, everything is fixed. And I make the challenge to directors listening to this. If you ring your company's call center, or if you have one, or any interaction, if you're B2B, it doesn't matter. You're not off the hook there. can the company solve the problem like Apple did for Elizabeth? So they're not using the data to reprice her or gouge her or sell the information for some nefarious gain. They're not doing that at all. They are doing it to optimize for her. And that's what good looks like. And the irony of this moment is everyone listening to this podcast and every one of our customers knows what good looks like. That's why this imperative is so real.
We talked a bit about the board as a collective and the board's role in oversight. But what about you personally as a chair and as a board member? How have you used AI to make you a better director?
Yes, I certainly have, and I'll explain what I've done there. So at the NRMA, I built a chair advisory tool for me, and this was through Claude, and I extracted some of the learnings that I'm aware of via Quantium and others. Anyway, my advisory data repository here has 2,000 pages in it. It's got an enormous amount of information on the NRMA. I would take myself for a walk with the dog and I would dictate.
Just to stop you there, what sort of information did you put into Claude?
Sure. 5 years of annual reports, the Constitution, and the dictation of how I wanted it to think and act, and try to make it reflective of me, like my tone of style, what matters most, what am we really trying to achieve, detailed thoughts, really. So that now exists, and then I could call on that for advice, which I did. And that concept you hear people talking about, a thought partner, it really is a thought partner, a real-time thought partner. So the example, which I found this to be phenomenal. So in December last year, the night before the board meeting, there was an acquisition. IAG launched an acquisition on RACQ's insurance business. Perfectly entitled to do that. They did that. We turn up for the board meeting. It is breaking news. And of course, the board's agitate. What does it mean? What are we going to do about this? It means a lot. There's a lot in the back of that for the NRMA to ponder. So, we're talking to CEOs, answering the question, rapid fire. It's not on the agenda item. So everyone listening to this knows what that's like. It is not on the agenda, and now we have to deal with it in real time. So I took a photo of the AFR article announcing the deal. I asked Claude if Warren Buffett and Michael Porter were here with the 2,000 pages of knowledge and the breaking news, what's the three questions, best questions, they would each ask the CEO. The questions were so powerful, so thoughtful. So I asked the question. I told the board, so this is what I'm doing. And then I said, well, digested some of the responses and said, well, why could you craft me the action arising? Which it did. And it was really, really thoughtful, which I read out to everybody. So what's going on there? Like, we're accelerating our thinking. We are moving faster. We're not blindly following its advice. It's back to how to decide who or what decides. You're not saying, I'm accepting all of that. You're just got an addition to your existing line of thinking. Very powerful. I've got other examples, but that one, if I only had one example, I'd play that one.
You've been an early adopter of AI and you're an enthusiastic adopter of AI. Some of your director peers might be a bit slower. They might be a bit nervous. They might be a bit hesitant. What's the best way for them to get up to speed with AI and start to familiarize themselves with the technology?
Yeah, I think the more things change, the more we have to learn. So I think it's on all of us to learn. That's why I wrote the book. But there's lots of ways to learn. We just talked before, podcasts. There's wonderful podcasts out there about all of this. Quantium itself has its own Board Edge course, which many people are doing. I think there's learning tools everywhere. I've done a couple of courses in America. Some of them are online, and they're very good. So yeah, learn and get on the tools. That's the first. That's kind of put your own oxygen mask on first. Is my advice. Get experts to come and talk. Learn. There's lots of smart people around who can give you a hand, and there's companies who can help you get this right. So yeah, it's all about understanding, because if you don't understand it, it will be a barrier. It will be a barrier, I think, particularly to people in the organisation who are keen to watch the organisation adopt and grow.
You mentioned experts a moment ago. Do you think some organizations will need to look at the composition of their boards, and do they have the right skills mix? There might be some cases, for example, it's appropriate for an organization to have an AI expert on the board. Is that something you think could be useful?
I mean, it certainly could be useful. It would be situational. I think it's going to be better to have everybody learn. And if I go back to that internet experience, I mean, the risk here is people think they can effectively delegate this need to one person or a department. I think it's too large to be something that's delegatable. So I think it's a whole of org adoption, and it's a whole of board learning.
Tim, let's bring together AI and your time as chair at NRMA. You were on the board there for a long time. You were the chair for a long time. And the organization has changed quite a lot during that period. So how did you use AI, data, and analytics to help transform the NRMA?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for the question. I guess maybe just take a little step back. So the NRMA 104-year-old mutual was in a bit of a hard spot. The core business was being challenged. This is the roadside business being challenged. And so we were really conscious of how do we find our future. It was the idea of sunset, sunrise. So how do you spawn sunrise businesses effectively? So how do you use information from the customer to better predict their needs? And how do you create an ecosystem that feeds insight back to the C-suite, the whole organization, and the board? That's kind of the mission, and that's my favorite thing in the world to think about. And Rowan Lund, the CEO, comes from a digital world. He was at Yahoo. So you're pushing on an open door with Rowan about how to set that ecosystem up. And so we found ways to better predict customer needs. And what was really satisfying about this, we boiled the ocean on the customer data effectively. And we could see that loyalty, the definition of loyalty, was actually coming from when members used a service, not just roadside, but something else. So if you stay in a holiday park, as well as being a roadside customer, you need table stakes, look after them, treat them well. But if you tick those two things off, loyalty goes up in the core business. So that was the killer insight. And off the back of that, we moved a lot of the balance sheet over to travel and tourism. And the net result of that, which I'm so delighted about, so in the last 24 months, so the last 2 full fin years there, revenue is up 40%. So it's a 104-year-old mutual growing like a tech company. And I think that's evidence that, if you can stay close to the customer and move, and as long as you're serving the customer well, stay close to them, and you're not stretching the brand to places where it doesn't belong, you're going to be able to leverage information in powerful ways.
Let's keep talking about your time as chair. We said at the top you've somewhat recently stepped down, but you held that chair position for 7 years. What did you learn about the chair role during that time period?
a lot. Yeah, I think it's it's a deeply intellectual process, I think. At the end of a board meeting, I remember you're tired. You work really hard, even though it may not look like you're working that hard, but it's intellectually fascinating. And I was really lucky. And along the way, I've had some unbelievable people cross my path. So, I've been part of this charity, Bestest, and Bob Hawke was the founding chair of that. And watching Bob Hawke chair a meeting is a masterclass. So learning from someone like Bob Hawke, you just couldn't believe it. Like, I was a much younger man at the time. I worked at Time Warner. Now, Dick Parsons was the chair of Time Warner. He was the chair of Citibank. He was the chair of Estee Lauder. One of the most incredible, recently passed away, unfortunately, but an amazing man. He had 3 days in Sydney, and I can remember just being glued to every word he said. And he had this sense of, it was curiosity, empathy. He was always trying to learn. He was never forceful, often really funny. But you could tell there was a mind there just. He told me this, was pretty incredible. Time Warner at the time, I think, had 450,000 people, something like that. And he said he answered, if you email him, he'll answer it every time. Just this discipline to be, grassroots. And the other thing which I think is just a fabulous piece of advice is, this idea of there is a silent voice of the customer in every board meeting. And how do you hear that? And how do you make sure that voice, because they're not in the room, how do you actually make sure you hear it?
You said that before you became chair of NRMA, you spoke to John Mullen and got some advice. Some of our listeners might just be beginning their own time as chair. If someone approached you and asked for advice on how to be a really effective chair, what would you tell them?
Well, that's a great compliment. I hope you're right. I would tell them, bring curiosity and empathy first. Make sure your conversational skills in and out of the boardroom are as respectful as possible. Ask yourself, who is the quietest voice in the room and how do you make sure they're heard? Because the extroverts and the loud voices, they're always going to be heard, but there's often another voice that needs to be heard. Develop a really good relationship with the CEO. So we had this, and this is kind of, everyone knows this, but we really tried to adhere to it. Zero surprise. I should not be reacting in any way that surprises the CEO. And there should be nothing that's coming out in the meeting from the CEO that I'm not expecting. And they're kind of table stakes things. Agendas matter. Where is the attention of the board? And how that's a battle. That's a real battle, in particularly in this complicated world we have. But they would be some of the things I'm and get advice. Find your own mentor and learn. I've done the AICD's. I did the chairs course here. I did a Harvard course. Just keep learning.
The NRMA is more than 100 years old, but it can be, I imagine, quite a complex organisation. It's got more than 3 million members. That's an enormous figure. I imagine that can be quite a difficult stakeholder group to manage sometimes and varied within those 3 million people. So what did you learn about, I guess, stakeholder management as the chair of the NRMA?
So much of the information of the NRMA and most organisations, you can go back to the source documents. You can actually go back to what was the founder's intent, which we did. So, and that the alignment back to the founder's intent is, I think, sometimes a really powerful thing to do. So what really matters, there's 3 things that really matter: cost of motoring, how you serve the customer, and what are you doing for them outside of that? Like, lobbying for better petrol prices and those sorts of things. And if you are pure to those things, the big buckets are going to be fine. But everything you said is completely true also. And there's 3 million members and a world where, when you show up on Netflix, there's a personalization engine that's discrete for each individual. So you have to do that as well. So you have to have a segment of one mentality and treat everybody individually because they are. But the engine of the machine of the organization has got to be nailing the 3 things that they are most cognizant of.
We've talked about the beginning of your time as chair. Let's talk about the end. You left the organization on good terms. What insights do you have on a successful transition from one chair to another?
First thing I say is it's much harder than I thought it would be. I thought it'd be hard, but it was harder. And it takes time. So if you're listening to this and you're pondering it, if you think you need X amount of time, it's probably 2 and maybe 3X. I made my intention to the board clear as early as possible, and we took a lot of external advice too. We had great search firms working for you, great external advisors, and then ultimately dialogue, with each individual board member about what are their intentions, but who might want to be chair. Who would be the best fit for chair? I think the word fit is the key word. To be in the boardroom this day and age, you have to have skills. But the fit is the ultimate test of how well it's going to work. So we were running it all through skills matrix, future need, but it took time and we landed in a great place. I mean, Derek Stanwell is a fantastic new chairman of the NRMA, and Natalie Walker, who replaced me on the board, is a brilliant director. So I couldn't be happier how it ended up. And I hope it works really well for the NRMA.
We've spoken quite a bit about the NRMA, but let's shift now to some of your other roles. As we said, you've been a founding shareholder of Quantium and you're also an advisor there. You've invested in a lot of other tech companies as well. So you've been around these big, large, established organizations like the NRMA, and then at the other end, you've been around smaller, newer organizations, startups, scale-ups. What do you think those 2 groups can learn from each other?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think the answer is a lot. So what's great about working with founders and early stage companies is, Warren Buffett's arrogance, bureaucracy, complacency doesn't exist. Well, if it exists, you don't even walk in the room. So they're in a hurry. Their aim is clear, but the chances of them having to change direction is extremely high. So they're going to be good at handling VUCA. In fact, they're going to be great at they need to be great at handling ambiguity. And if I just talk about the Quantium founders for a minute, Adam and Greg, incredibly good at handling ambiguity. And I look for that as a trait in entrepreneurs. How good are they going to be at handling ambiguity? Because there's going to be plenty of it. And I think increasingly, I was only just reflecting on this the other day, the boardroom of today and tomorrow is full of VUCA. And ambiguity is growing everywhere. Complexity is growing everywhere. Uncertainty is growing everywhere. And volatility is growing everywhere. So those two worlds of what was essential for an entrepreneur, I think are now becoming essential for business. Here's a prediction, always dangerous predictions. 2025, we'll probably look back and say that was the calmest year we ever saw as the speed of change accelerates in every direction. So strap yourself in because volatility and ambiguity is here to stay.
What does that mean for directors? What do boards do in these extraordinarily uncertain times, especially if, as you think, the volatility is just going to increase and increase?
We're all going to have to be more adaptive, more flexible, more creative, and there's no way around that. And what was set in stone, nothing is constant. Everything's reinventing itself the whole time. So just having, I guess, the mental processes to be thinking, what might our customers be doing? What is the future of our customers' need? We used to start our offsites, and that was every time I'd ask that question, how are we going to predict the future customer need? That, I think, is the essence of strategy increasingly. How do we know what that might be? Some of it's impossible to predict, of course, but some things remain really constant. And you can think about, if you go back to the NRMA example of, they are going to always want lower cost motoring. They are going to want great service. Those things don't change. So how are you going to use the new world order, the new world technologies to apply to the things are not going to change? And then how are you going to capture some of the things that are going to change in your favor?
I wanted to ask you also about your career before entering the boardroom. You've been a director for a long time, but you had a lengthy executive career before then. You worked in the media for a long time. What made you want to become a board member, though?
Yeah. It was actually watching other boards. As you grow up through the ranks, in corporate life, you end up presenting to boards. And sometimes that experience was fantastic and sometimes it was a deeply learning experience. But you watch what was good and what was bad, and you start to open your mind to that. And when I did my MBA, I remember I paid great attention to the section. They had a section on boards, actually, which I found fascinating. And I think it sort of twigged my mind to, well, one day I really would like to do that. And, it's somewhere where you can, really help organisations, I think. And if you get the right board, you can help society as well. And if you can do both together, well, that's just a joy. So, I've been very fortunate how that's played out, and I've really enjoyed it. And it's intellectually stimulating working with other people,
Was it challenging at first, shifting from that executive mindset to then being a board member?
Yeah, it was. The advice I got, and it's probably the advice a lot of others have had too, is, you can cut your teeth in a not-for-profit where you've got a passion. So, I'm asthmatic, and I joined the Asthma Foundation board a long time ago, a very long time ago. But it was great. I felt like I'm here to try and help, and you learn, and it opens the door of what this world with board starts to look like.
Another not-for-profit you were involved in was the Bestest Foundation. You mentioned that a little bit earlier, but you founded that with the late and great Bob Hawke. How did that foundation come about?
Yeah. So, look, I'm a co-founder along with many other wonderful people. It's a long list. I won't read them all out, but if you're listening, congratulations. It's a great team of people, fabulous people. Yeah, well, look, we were a fundraising arm of another charity, which I'm not going to name, and we got a little bit frustrated, actually, that we'd raise a lot of money, and a lot of the money ends up going through a machine that is buying software, paying rent, got salaries, doing great work. But if you say, of every dollar we raised the top line, how many went to disadvantaged? What percent went to a disadvantaged child? Often that is diluted. So we said, how do we start a virtual charity where every dollar of the top line drops straight through to the disadvantaged child? And that was our aim. So we created a model that could do that. So it's virtual, and the board, we underwrite the costs. So we have an event. We've got fabulous chefs who donate their time, and it's been a wonderful journey of great food. Bestest chefs, actually. But the board underwrites the cost of the event. So every dollar comes and flows straight through to the children. And it's been really rewarding. It's been a fantastic initiative.
We said that Bob Hawke was one of the co-founders there. What were some of the leadership lessons you took from Bob Hawke?
Well, he had this technique. So I'm going out there now. So if you're listening to this, use this sparingly, but it was incredible. When something was complicated, Bob had this technique and he would say, I'm going to go around the room. I'm going to ask you for your opinion of the glass. You have 60 seconds to talk about the glass and give this room your best advice on the glass. If you mention anything other than the glass, I will cut you off. And that's the end of your contribution to the meeting. And talk about intensity. So he'd go around the room and everyone, you just give it your best shot. And it was powerful. Now, I'm not advocating that for a regular use in boardrooms. I'm not doing that. But he had techniques like that. The other thing he used to do, which was just fabulous, and I was a young executive, just in awe of this incredible guy. But sometimes you had a meeting, sometimes you're a bit off your game or you're a bit quiet or whatever. And at the end of the meeting, you'd walk out and he'd sometimes just grab me in the lift or ring you later and say, you're a bit quiet today, Tim, is everything okay? Can I help you in any way? And he was just opening up how he could help me in anything, like just a giver, And I think they're just great traits. It's empathy ultimately. He had, he could ring anybody, ask for anything, and sometimes he'd do that when he needed it for the charity, but he was collegiate, kind and smart.
Bob Hawke's not the only prominent Australian you've been around. You also worked at PBL for a long time. Any Kerry Packer stories you can share with us?
Kerry was incredible. I worked with James and Kerry, and I loved my time there. It was like being on a rocket ship. Everything moved fast. And that they say in the military, they talk about commander's intent. The commander's intent is clear and you understood it. And it's often quite a good guiding. When I first joined PBL, I had a meeting with Kerry and he said to me, do you know the rules, Tim? I said, no. What are the rules? He goes, the rules are you have to, I was running a division. You have to make that division perform really highly. You cannot break any law in the performance of your job or the department. And that's it. Go. That was the briefing. Quite a good briefing, actually. And he was also, as was James, they could talk about strategy. They could talk about global affairs strategy, or they could talk about tiny things in the business that they'd noticed. So they still had that founders, if there was an error in a magazine or something, they would go from macro to micro and all over the detail in between. Incredible experience, actually.
Tim, you've been very generous with your time, so thank you. It's great to have you on Boardroom Confidential.
Thank you very much, Ben. I've enjoyed the conversation.